Well, it is a pleasure to be with you all this morning. I hope you all had a wonderful holiday. Aaron and I went to Indiana to see Aaron's side of the family and had a wonderful time. And I hope you all, whether you traveled or whether you stayed here, I hope that it was a year full of memories, a year full of laughter. I wanted to start our conversation today actually with a little game. And so this is going to be a little walk down memory lane because as I was thinking about the conversation I wanted to have this morning, it occurred to me that this isn't just the end of one year and the start of another, but it's the end of a decade and the start of another. And as I think about decades, the more kind of research I did, the more I reflected on it, the more that I realized that decades in living memory have been quite unique. And so here's how we're going to play this game. This is full audience participation. I've put together some collages of major events, personalities, things that have happened in various decades through the last 70, 80 years. So I'm going to throw it up there, and I want to see how long it takes you to figure out which decade is represented. Make sense? Okay? So some of you this might be some nostalgia, some memories here. Take a look. All right, you see Michael Jackson's Thriller down there. You see some shoulder pads. You see Princess Di, Cosby Show. This was the 1980s, the fall of Berlin Wall. Okay, what about this one? There's a little discrepancy here. What are we talking? Race to the Moon? Race to the Moon was kind of right there on the cusp there, but Elvis Presley was the highest grossing music artist of the 1950s. I Love Lucy and her Vitamin to Vegemin episode. That was one of the highest rated episodes of that. All right, what about this one? Got some Elton John. 70s. Yep. You can see right there in the middle the bell bottoms. Those were supposed to be the big giveaway there. All right, that was 1970s. What about this one? Oh, there's a little so Google. So there's the Twin Towers there. American Idol premiered in the 2000s, and Eminem was the highest grossing music artist of the 2000s. And you know who knew that? And I had to go look it up. You know who knew that was Paul Rock. I don't know why. Okay, that was the 2000s. What about this one? 60s. We got the Beatles. And Martin Luther King, got some fun fashion over there, and then we got the moonwalk. All right, what about this one? 90s, we got some boy bands, we got some Mariah Carey. Seinfeld was the highest rated television show of the 90s, like 7 of the 10 years. They were there, and then some personalities. See, this is my generation right here. We are like, oh, that's nostalgic. All right, and last one here. What about this? All right, the Royals win the World Series. That was your biggest clue there, right? So it was the 2010s, 2010s, or whatever we're calling that. Sunday Night Football was the highest rated show on television in the 2010s. NCIS was the highest rated TV drama. And Drake was the highest grossing music artist of the 2010s. So, fun walk down memory lane. What I noticed, though, in that is decades are branded in a way. There's some signature things that happen, not just because of the events that happen, but because of the style and the culture and the conversations that we were having. They're marked. In history, they're kind of set in stone. We can recognize them when we see them. Even when they start to come back and fashions tend to recycle and we tend to see them again, we're like, oh, that's an 80s look. Why? Because in the 80s, something new was happening, and that's what was branded by that. I want you to think about, so this is kind of a moment of reflection. I want you to get comfortable. If you want to close your eyes, this is my 10-year. This is 2009 to 2019, Jimmy. I want you to think about where you were 10 years ago. So December of 2009, we were about to start a new decade then. And I want you to think about a few questions here. Where were you? In 2009, what was something you were looking forward to? Who were the closest people in your life? And I really wanted to include this question. What was the hardest thing you had been through to date at that point in time? The hardest, most difficult, challenging life event that you had encountered. What was the hardest thing that you had encountered by December of 2009? There's a lot that I hope just went through your mind. 10 years is a long time. And I'll give you my Cliff's Notes version, and I hope not to inspire too much jealousy in this, but actually at New Year's Eve of 2009 going to 2010, I was in Sydney, Australia, and I was about to watch the fireworks over Sydney Harbor. So I kicked off the 2010s with a bang. It was as incredible as it sounds. I was living in Georgia. I was working at a great organization with people I loved, doing what I would have considered at that time to be my dream job. I was traveling all over the world, sending people all over the world, and by 2010, 2011, I was probably at the top of my game when it came to that time in my life and that time at that organization. And then at the end of 2011, everything fell apart. And by the end of 2012, I had lost all of that. It was a big falling out at the organization. And while it wasn't directed to me personally, I was on the wrong side of it and ended up transitioning out and losing it all. 2013, I moved to Thailand and I lived abroad. A team and I raised a bunch of money and opened up a restaurant on the Thailand-Myanmar border so that we could hire Burmese refugees and migrant workers and pay them a livable wage. And come this April, it will have been operating for 7 years, which is a pretty amazing accomplishment. I went into that's good times, yeah, go. It's called Famous Ray's. If you ever go to Mae Sot, Thailand, check out Famous Ray's. That's our burger joint. 2013 was also the year that I came out and experienced one of the most liberating and darkest seasons of my life. 2014, I moved to Kansas City, which was a new lease on life, a new change. I had my first love. I had my first heartbreak. 2015, I met my now husband. 2017, we got married here. 2018, we bought our first house here. And just a couple months ago, we matched with a birth mom who is due in February. So I don't know if your story's like my story, but that's a pretty big roller coaster of events. And if I'm going to think back I'm going to share with you in a few minutes here kind of some of the lessons that I learned in this decade. But man, I had a lot of material to work with in all of the things that we encountered. And as I was thinking about kind of the lesson to take away from this, I was drawn back to Joshua chapter 4. And Joshua, if you remember in the story, Moses and all of that, leaving Egypt, traveling through the wilderness, making it to the edge of the promised land. Moses is able to see it, but isn't allowed to go into it. And Joshua, his protege, steps up and leads the Israelites into the promised land. And here we are right at the beginning of their journey. And if you'll remember, they've already passed over the Reed Sea, escaping Egypt. Here they are kind of crossing another river, the River Jordan, which was another impassable place for them to go. But something miraculous happens. God intervenes. And this is how Joshua responds to that after all that they have been through. So I want to read a few excerpts from Joshua chapter 4. When the entire nation had finished crossing over the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Pick 12 men from the people, 1 man per tribe. Command them, pick up 12 stones from right here in the middle of the Jordan, where the feet of the priests had been firmly planted. Bring them across with you and put them down in the camp where you're staying tonight." The Israelites did exactly what Joshua ordered. They lifted 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, matching the number of tribes of the Israelites, exactly as the Lord had said to Joshua. They brought them over to the camp and put them down there. Joshua also set up 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan where the feet of the priests had stood while carrying the covenant chest. They are still there today. Joshua set up at Gilgal those 12 stones they had taken from the Jordan. And he said to the Israelites, "In the future, your children will ask their parents, 'What about these stones?' Then you will let your children know, 'Israel crossed over the Jordan here on dry ground.' This was because the Lord your God dried up the water of the Jordan before you until you crossed over. This was exactly what the Lord your God did to the Reed Sea. He dried it up before us until we crossed over. And here's what I want you to hear. This happened so that all the earth's people might know that the Lord's power is great and that you may always revere the Lord your God." Friends, this is the word of the Lord. What I want you to notice is the commemoration of these events. And this was not a unique habit, a unique process for the Israelites to go through. This happened pretty frequently, where something major would happen. They would set up an altar, they would set up a pillar, they would set up a bunch of stones, but they did these things to remember what had happened. The Israelites suffered a lot. They also had encounters with some incredible things, as the story goes. They had interactions with friendly groups of people, with hostile groups of people, but every step of the way, no matter what happened, they had this habit of setting up remembrances. And they did so, if you think back to this story, they did so that when future generations would come back and they would see what had happened, they would remember, they would know the story, they would hear the story, they would be inspired to ask about what happened. And it kind of was indiscriminate as far as, was this a good thing or was this a bad thing? In this case, this was cause for celebration. And other times, it was cause for grief and for mourning. But no matter what the case, they had this habit of remembering. And that's a little bit of what I want to inspire you with this morning. This is our last Sunday of a year and of a decade. And we're moving into a new season in many respects. It might look a lot like this last season, or it might look completely different than this last season. The question is what do we want it to look like? Where is this going? If we could think ahead 10 years from now and think about the stones that are going to be set up, what is it going to be commemorating? What is it going to be celebrating? And are we dreaming big? Are we thinking big? I want you to take a look at this quote. The size of your dreams must always exceed your current capacity to achieve them. If your dreams don't scare you, they aren't big enough. I liked this quote because I want us to think about some big things that are happening when it comes to hope, but I also want us to grasp the significance and the sacredness of the things that really need to happen here in the next 10 years. This is an important decade for us as a planet. I wanted to share with you, I mentioned this earlier, some lessons that I learned over these last 10 years, because for me, verbalizing and articulating these lessons are my stones. These are the things that I'm going to set up, that I'm going to have as a remembrance for what happened to me during the 2010s decade. So I want you to think about these with me. First lesson that I learned, when fear is an option, choose courage. At the beginning of this decade, I actually got a tattoo that said brave. And I did that because this year required a lot of me. There was a lot to be afraid of in my personal life. Coming out, losing a job, moving to a new city, trying to win people over, giving love a chance. There was a lot to be afraid of. And one of the things that I learned about fear in this decade, and this could probably be a whole sermon in and of itself, is that typically people are afraid of one of three things: change, loss, or the unknown. Change, loss, or the unknown. And those are the things that will motivate us to either fight for something or to go into denial and run away from it completely, or even just sit there paralyzed. There's a lot to be afraid of. And courage is not the absence of fear. I think that was a mantra for me over the last 10 years. Courage doesn't mean that you're not afraid. Courage is what you do when you're afraid. When you're afraid of change. When you're afraid of loss. And I tell you, I've lost a lot this year. I've gained more. But I lost a lot. And a lot of what kept me from going into that was the anxiety and the fear of what will I do if this doesn't happen? What will I do if I lose this? The thought of loss, the thought of the unknown, a lot of times that's what paralyzes us. Bravery and courage is what you do in the face of it. There's no such thing as a life without fear. So when fear is an option, choose courage. Secondly, we all have to share this space. That's one thing that I've learned this year, because I've come out of a worldview and ideology that looks very different than the one I have right now. We have to live in an environment with all sorts, wherever you are on the political spectrum, wherever you are on the thoughts of diversity, thoughts of orientation, the thoughts of people who share different beliefs than you, we have to share this space. We are all here together. And we have to figure out what we're going to do about it. The truth is that the 2010s, we are going to have to address what's going on our planet. We're going to have to address it. The urgency is there. We're actually going to be talking about environmentalism over Lent come this next spring. And we're going to talk about it because we have to. This is important. We all share this space. So what are we going to do to work together to coexist? And one of the other lessons I learned was a shift in ideology for me. The shift from living focused on the journey versus focused on the destination. Now, see, I grew up in a conservative Christian environment where end times, the afterlife, that was the only motivation, the only focal point for how you lived your life. Everything else was a means to that end. And you live a certain way when that becomes the most important thing in your life. How it defines your actions, the things I remember when I came out, it was said to me, why do you think you deserve to be happy? Like you get eternity to be happy. You suffer now so that you can be happy later. Like, this is just a blip on the radar. And the implication was just make it through. Just get to the end, no matter what you have to do, hang tough, it'll all be over soon. That has some really big consequences. And I lived with a lot of those consequences and a lot of those messages in my life. And actually, part of transitioning to Kansas City really helped me start to rebuild my ideology and thinking more about how we live actually does matter. It actually matters a lot. How we treat each other, how we treat our space, how we treat each other's point of view, how we communicate. This is actually really important. The present, the now, what's going on here, what God is doing in our lives, in our city, in our world. This isn't just today is not a means to an end. Today actually really matters. And that shift will absolutely inspire you, as it did me, to think and act really differently. These are my stones. This is what I've taken on my journey across the riverbed, picked up along the way. And I want to be able to look back and say, I'm going to take these lessons with me into this next decade. Because I'm sure this next decade is going to have a lot to teach me, especially about childhood. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot to experience. So I want you to think for just a second as we go into our time of reflection here. We're going to have a hymn. And we're doing Christmas stuff today because it's kind of our last chance to before we move on to the new season. So I hope that's okay that we're remembering this, even though the day is over, we're still going to kind of celebrate this. But I want you to think ahead. What are the stones that you're going to take with you from this decade? And if we could project ourselves 10 years in the future, what are the things that we're going to focus on? If we could be proactive at all, where are we going to go? What are we going to do? What picture are we going to put up on the wall 10 years from now and say, oh yeah, that was the 2020s? Because we're not victims. We actually have the freedom and the rights and the empowerment and the autonomy to make this next season what we want it to be. I think it's going to be an exciting decade, to say the least. But I hope it's meaningful and memorable for us all. So we're going to go into a reflection hymn, Silent Night. And I want you can sing, you can think. It's number 122. We're just going to do about 3 verses of it. I want you to think about that as we go into this next